History books often tell us about kings, knights, and battles. But what about the women who lived when men ruled everything? From the chores that filled their days, to the laws that shaped their marriages, to the quiet power some gained through faith and work, medieval women's lives were far more complex than we are usually told. Tonight we'll slow down and explore the hidden, often forgotten details of how women truly lived in the Middle Ages. So settle in. Let the details carry you. And by the end, you may see the medieval world in a very different way. Chapter 1. The Early Lives of Medieval Women. When you think of the Middle Ages, the images that most often come to mind are knights in shining armor, stone castles, crusades, or perhaps bustling markets full of wool, wine, and spices. But far less attention is given to the quieter, uncelebrated lives of women who lived within this medieval framework. Their experiences were shaped not only by the expectations of men, but also by the demands of survival, custom, and the subtle shifts of law and religion. To understand medieval society, you cannot overlook the lives of its women, who, while rarely holding formal power, carried much of the daily burden of sustaining families and communities. Let us begin with the earliest stage of a medieval woman's life, her childhood. From the very start, her role in society was predetermined by factors beyond her control: her family's wealth, her place of birth, and her father's decisions. In wealthy households, noble daughters were valuable assets, seen less as individuals and more as strategic pieces in the great chessboard of medieval alliances. Marriages were rarely about love. Instead, they were designed to cement treaties, secure land, or gain influence. A daughter could be promised in marriage at a remarkably young age, sometimes as early as 7 or 8, though the actual wedding ceremony would not take place until adolescence. In poorer households, where survival was the primary concern, girls learned practical skills from the earliest years. A peasant girl would spend much of her day helping her mother, grinding grain, fetching water, tending to chickens or goats, and gathering firewood. Unlike noble girls who were often taught the art of embroidery, letter writing, and music, the daughters of commoners received their education in the rhythms of necessity. It was not a question of whether they would work, but how soon they could contribute. Religion also shaped their world. In medieval Europe, Christianity dominated daily life, and women were taught the example of the Virgin Mary, pure, obedient, and humble. Yet they were also warned about Eve, who was blamed for bringing sin into the world. This paradox meant that women lived with a kind of double expectation: to embody both the ideal of holiness and the burden of inherited guilt. For a girl entering adulthood, this duality was not merely an abstract teaching. It influenced how communities saw her and how she saw herself. As girls grew into young women, one of the most pressing concerns was marriage. By the age of 12 or 13, many were considered marriageable, though actual unions often took place in the mid to late teens. A marriage contract was rarely a personal choice. Instead, it was an arrangement negotiated by fathers, lords, or, in the case of peasants, by the practical needs of survival. A peasant family might marry off a daughter to secure access to land or livestock, while a noble family might see her wed as part of a larger political strategy. The wedding ceremony itself reflected both religious devotion and legal formality. It might take place outside the church, at the door, where vows were exchanged, before the couple entered for Mass. This symbolism underscored the idea that marriage was both a spiritual and social contract. Dowries, gifts of property, or money given by the bride's family, were essential even for those of modest means. A woman without a dowry often had fewer prospects for marriage, which left her vulnerable. But what awaited women once they became wives? The household became their domain, but it was far from a place of leisure. For noble women, the household was a complex economic unit to manage. They oversaw servants, organized supplies, and maintained order in the estate while husbands were often away at war or attending to feudal duties. For peasant women, the work was relentless and physical, tending fields alongside their husbands, brewing ale, spinning wool, baking bread, and raising children. In both cases, women carried much of the invisible labor that allowed medieval society to function. Childbirth, too, defined much of a woman's life. It was both common and dangerous. Women might expect to bear numerous children, yet many would not survive infancy, and the risk to the mother was ever present. Midwives played an essential role in these moments, offering knowledge passed down through generations, though their position was precarious. The church often scrutinized their practices, and accusations of superstition or witchcraft could surface. Still, midwives remained central to the fabric of women's lives. Not every woman followed the path of marriage. For some, the convent offered an alternative. Monastic life provided education, spiritual purpose, and in some cases, a measure of independence that could not be found within marriage. Nuns could rise to positions of authority as abbesses, managing estates and influencing local communities. But even here, women lived within the boundaries of male authority, as monasteries were ultimately tied to church hierarchies controlled by men, whether married or cloistered. Medieval women existed within a system that valued their labor, but rarely recognized their voices. Legal documents often list them as extensions of their husbands or fathers. A woman could not generally hold property independently unless widowed, and even then, her rights were often contested. Still, widows sometimes wielded surprising power, running estates or businesses in the absence of men. Their independence, however, was often temporary, as families and communities sought to see them remarried. Education for women was limited, yet not absent. In wealthy circles, some women learned to read and write, contributing to literature, theology, and correspondence. Noblewomen such as Christine de Pizan in the 14th century became notable writers, questioning women's roles in society. For most, though, knowledge was practical rather than scholarly, rooted in the cycles of planting, cooking, healing, and craft. This blend of constraint and contribution defined the everyday existence of medieval women. They bore the burdens of reproduction, domestic management, and agricultural labor, often without recognition. Yet their presence was essential. Without women's work, noble households would collapse, villages would falter, and children would not survive. In this sense, the medieval world leaned heavily on the shoulders of women, even while denying them formal acknowledgement. If you look closely at the fabric of medieval society, you see the threads of women's lives woven everywhere, from the fields of peasants to the halls of noble estates. And yet, their stories are often hidden beneath the surface, overshadowed by the wars and kings that dominate traditional history books. This raises a simple but important question. If women were so central to the survival of medieval communities, why were their roles so often minimized or erased in the historical record? Chapter 2. Work, Survival, and Hidden Authority in Medieval Women's Lives. When you picture the work of the Middle Ages, the mind often drifts to images of blacksmiths hammering iron, plowmen driving oxen across fields, or monks copying manuscripts in candlelit cloisters. What is less often pictured are women, yet they were everywhere in this medieval landscape, performing labor that was both visible and invisible. In many ways, they sustained the entire structure of society, though their contributions were rarely celebrated in chronicles or court records. To understand women's work in the Middle Ages, you need to step into both the peasant cottage and the noble estate. These two worlds look different, but they shared one unshakable truth. Women were indispensable. Peasant women, the labor of necessity in the rural world, where the majority of the medieval population lived. Women's work was bound to the cycles of the land. From dawn until dusk, peasant women labored alongside their husbands in the fields. They planted seeds, harvested crops, and tended livestock. Their day began early fetching water from the village well, stoking the hearth, and preparing a simple meal of porridge or bread before heading out to the fields. Fieldwork was seasonal. At harvest time, women were out cutting grain with sickles, binding sheaves, and gleaning the leftover stalks. During planting, they might scatter seeds or help drive animals to plow. Their hands also tended the family's kitchen garden, where herbs, beans, onions, and cabbages grew, forming the backbone of the family diet. But their work did not end when they came in from the fields. A peasant woman would then turn to the domestic labor that defined her existence, grinding grain into flour, baking coarse rye or barley bread, brewing ale, spinning wool into thread, mending clothes, and raising children. Each task required time and effort, and many of them overlapped. A woman might stir a pot of pottage while spinning wool with a drop spindle, all while keeping an eye on a toddler playing by the hearth. Her role extended to small-scale trade as well. Women often sold eggs, butter, or ale in the village marketplace, contributing directly to the family's income. These small profits were vital, especially in years when harvests failed or taxes were high. In fact, the brewing of ale was so central to women's lives in medieval England that there was even a term for them, alewives. Though later mocked and caricatured in literature, alewives provided an essential service to their communities. The life of a peasant woman was marked by exhaustion, yet also resilience. Survival required constant adaptation. In times of famine or hardship, she might turn to gathering wild herbs, berries, or roots to supplement the family diet. Her intimate knowledge of local plants and food preservation techniques often made the difference between life and starvation. Noblewomen, authority behind the curtain in contrast. Noblewomen occupied a different world, one that looked less backbreaking at first glance, but was no less demanding. Married into noble households, these women were expected to manage estates in their husband's absence, which was frequent given the demands of war, court service, or crusading. A noblewoman's responsibilities extended to overseeing the household staff, managing accounts, storing provisions, and ensuring that servants and peasants carried out their duties. In many ways, she acted as a steward. This was not a symbolic role. Records survive of noblewomen signing documents, managing estates, and even defending property rights in court. One striking example is Eleanor of Aquitaine, who not only managed her vast lands, but also influenced political affairs across France and England. While her story is exceptional, it illustrates the potential authority noblewomen could wield when circumstances allowed. Lesser-known noblewomen also left traces in records: widows who ran estates, wives who negotiated with tenants, or ladies who ensured supplies for castles under siege. But noblewomen's work was not purely administrative. They were expected to produce textiles, particularly fine linens and embroidery, for use within the household and as gifts or church offerings. This work, though tedious, carried symbolic weight. A noblewoman's embroidery might adorn church altars, reinforcing both family piety and social status. Noblewomen also managed marriages within their households. Daughters and younger relatives were placed under their care, and arranging suitable matches was part of the family strategy. In this sense, women themselves became managers of other women's futures. Even as they remained constrained by patriarchal expectations, widows, the window of independence. An interesting feature of medieval society was the role of widows. Upon the death of a husband, a woman often gained new authority. Widows could inherit property, manage estates, and engage in legal transactions. Some became businesswomen, running inns, workshops, or farms. The records of towns in England and France include widows who continued their husbands' trades, brewing ale, making shoes, or selling cloth. Yet this independence was precarious. Families often pressured widows to remarry, transferring property back into the control of men. The church, too, encouraged remarriage as a way of stabilizing society. Still, some widows resisted, finding in widowhood the only period of true autonomy in their lives. Women and work in towns by the later Middle Ages as towns grew. Women participated more visibly in urban economies. They worked as spinners, weavers, brewers, laundresses, midwives, and servants. Guilds, associations of craftsmen, sometimes allowed women to participate, especially as widows carrying on their husband's trade. Women also ran stalls in markets, selling food, cloth, or second-hand goods. Urban records show that women were an essential part of the workforce, even if guild regulations often excluded them from full membership. In many cases, women were legally invisible, their work recorded under their husbands' names. Yet without them, the fabric of urban life would have unraveled. Survival strategies and hidden knowledge. A less visible but equally important dimension of women's work was their knowledge of healing, midwifery, and household remedies. Women were often the first line of healthcare for their families and neighbors. They knew how to use herbs to treat fevers, poultices to heal wounds, and broths to nourish the sick. Midwives in particular played a vital role, guiding women through childbirth in an era when medical professionals were scarce. Yet this knowledge was fraught with risk. The Church grew increasingly suspicious of women's healing practices, associating them with superstition or even witchcraft. By the later Middle Ages, accusations of magical practices became a real danger for women who held this traditional knowledge. What had once been accepted as practical wisdom was recast as heretical or dangerous. The weight of obedience, despite the range of work women performed. Their lives remained framed by the expectation of obedience. Religious and legal texts consistently emphasized a woman's duty to submit to her husband. Sermons, confessional manuals, and household guides painted obedience as the cornerstone of a virtuous wife. But within these restrictions, women carved out spaces of influence. The act of managing a household, controlling food supplies, and raising children gave them practical power. A disobedient or incapable wife could bring ruin to a family, and communities knew this. The paradox of medieval women's lives was that they were simultaneously indispensable and undervalued. Hidden authority in plain sight. When you look closely at the records of the Middle Ages, you see countless glimpses of women exercising quiet authority. A peasant woman bargaining in the market over the price of eggs. A noblewoman deciding how to provision a castle. A widow suing for her inheritance in court. All these actions reveal agency that official histories often ignored. Women's authority was not usually formal or public, but it was embedded in the daily functions of survival. Without their work, medieval economies would have collapsed. Without their care, children would not have lived to adulthood. Without their management, households would not have thrived. And yet, in the eyes of medieval society, women remained secondary, defined through their relationships to men. This contradiction leads us to a pressing question. If women's labor was so essential and their influence so evident in daily life, why did the official voices of history chroniclers, clerics, and lawmakers go to such lengths to minimize their presence? Chapter 3. Faith, Symbols, and the Legacy of Medieval Women. If we've seen medieval women in their marriages and their work, there is still one final layer to understand: how society imagined them. For the Middle Ages was not only a world of farms, castles, and markets, it was also a world of sermons, saints, and symbols. How women were portrayed in these cultural frameworks deeply influenced their lives, sometimes elevating them, sometimes trapping them, Eve Mary. And the two faces of womanhood. The most powerful images of women in medieval Europe came from the Bible. Eve and Mary stood as two symbolic poles of femininity. Eve represented temptation, sin, and disobedience. Sermons often reminded women that Eve had led Adam astray, and therefore women were by nature weak, prone to deception, and in need of male guidance. Eve's legacy justified the constant drumbeat of female obedience in law codes, sermons, and domestic guides. Mary, on the other hand, embodied purity, obedience, and divine motherhood. She was venerated across Europe, her image painted in altarpieces, carved into cathedral portals, and sung about in hymns. Mary provided an ideal of womanhood, but one that was unattainable for ordinary women. To be simultaneously virgin, mother, and saint was an impossible standard together. Even Mary created a paradox. Women were seen as both dangerous and holy, sinful and redeeming, untrustworthy yet essential. Living under these dual symbols meant that every action a woman took could be interpreted through suspicion or reverence. Saints, nuns, and the spiritual path. Some women found in religion a path toward authority that ordinary domestic life could not provide. Nuns and abbesses wielded significant influence within convents. An abbess might control lands, direct the spiritual lives of dozens of women, and correspond with bishops and kings. In some cases, their authority rivaled that of male clerics. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen remind us of the intellectual and cultural power women could hold. Hildegard was a visionary, composer, writer, and healer. Her works were circulated across Europe, and her voice carried weight even with popes and emperors. Yet even in the cloister, women were not free from patriarchal oversight. Convents were supervised by male clergy, and women's spiritual authority was often dismissed as emotional or mystical rather than rational. Still, for those who chose the religious life or were placed there by their family's monastic life could provide a measure of learning, safety, and influence unavailable elsewhere. Wives, widows, and the law codes also reveal how women were seen. In many medieval systems, women were considered legal dependents of men, their fathers, then their husbands. But the law did acknowledge certain rights, especially for widows. Some charters and court rolls show women bringing cases, inheriting land, or defending their property. Dowries, too, illustrate the intertwining of law and symbolism. A dowry was more than property. It was a statement of a woman's value within the marriage system. Once transferred, it placed her within her husband's household, cementing the patriarchal order. And yet, in disputes, the dowry was often the lever by which women could claim financial rights. The church's watchful eye, perhaps the most shaping force on women's daily lives, was the church. Priests preached on proper female behavior. Confessors asked pointed questions about obedience, sexuality, and modesty. Marriage itself was framed as a sacrament controlled by ecclesiastical authority. The church's suspicion of women's bodies was never far away. Female sexuality was portrayed as dangerous, requiring control. At the same time, women were expected to bear children, anchoring society through reproduction. This contradiction meant that women lived under a constant tension. Their bodies were both necessary and suspect. Popular culture, from jokes to fairy tales. Outside the pulpit, women were portrayed in ballads, tales, and popular jokes. Many medieval stories cast wives as nagging, cunning, or foolish stereotypes that reinforced male authority. Satirical poems about alewives or gossiping women circulated widely, cementing these images. And yet, in folklore and romance literature, women sometimes appeared as wise helpers, enchantresses, or rulers of courtly love. The figure of the lady in chivalric romances inspired knights, controlled their loyalty, and symbolized refinement. These images, while idealized, gave women symbolic power and cultural imagination. Even if not in law or politics, the silent majority. It is important to remember that most medieval women peasants, servants, small traders, mothers, and daughters, left little written record. Their names vanish in documents, their lives folded into those of their husbands and fathers. What we know often comes from the edges of legal cases, tax rolls, or sermons, but silence does not mean absence. Every loaf of bread baked, every thread spun, every child raised, every harvest gathered, these invisible acts of labor, sustained medieval Europe as surely as the knights and kings who dominate the chronicles. The legacy of women in a world of men So how should we remember medieval women? Were they oppressed, silenced, and controlled by men? Yes, but they were also resourceful, resilient, and quietly influential. They lived under laws and customs designed to limit them. Yet they carved out spaces of survival and even authority. In the rhythms of daily labor, in the negotiations of marriage and widowhood, in the quiet authority of convents and estates, medieval women sustained the world around them. Though chroniclers may have ignored them, the evidence of their presence is woven through every record of the time. And perhaps that is the final paradox. Women in the Middle Ages lived in a world that ruled them. Yet they were the very foundation on which that world stood. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me tonight, exploring the slower, often overlooked parts of history. If you found this journey calming or comforting, I'd love for you to join me again. Please take a moment to like this video, and if you haven't already, subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep for more gentle stories to help you rest. Wishing you peace, calm, and a good night's sleep.